in many ways you could say that Schumpeter gives a kind of ironic critique of capitalism insofar as he is seemingly capitalism's like greatest fan, but he isn't a fan of the kind of ideological delusion that most people that are pro-capitalist think capitalism is. Instead, Schumpeter, it seems, really fucking understands capitalism and understands it profoundly and nevertheless is a fan of it. And it's very interesting because he does this kind of massive kind of synthesis where he spends the first part of the book being quite charitable yet also critical towards Karl Marx and taking on so many of the anti-capitalist critiques. You can see that he's read Veblen, for example, and you can see that he's basically well versed in kind of every perspective in economics, more or less for his time. This book came out in 1942, but you can see that he kind of like it takes in a socialist critique of capitalism or a socialist critique of capitalist apologetics and then kind of affirms it and amplifies it in a certain sense and says, yes, like this is how capitalism works and isn't it great? And so his kind of critique of conventional economics is kind of interspersed with his analysis. But then perhaps most interestingly is that it seems like what he's driving at and why he spends some time on Marx at the beginning is that he's kind of driving at a kind of thesis that capitalism will be a victim of its own success. And so he kind of sets up his analysis of Marx and, obviously Marx's theory, capitalism's internal contradictions will ultimately tear it down and bring forth like this kind of new socialist mode of production. Whereas for Schumpeter, interestingly, he agrees with Marx and disagrees with Marx at the same time. He agrees that socialism is kind of the imminent potential of capitalism and that capitalism will collapse under its own weight, but that capitalism will be a victim of, as I said before, its own success rather than its failure. And this is actually just this, I just think a really interesting thesis and an incredibly interesting book. He begins, as I said, part one is just him kind of talking about Marx, and he kind of praises Marx as a thinker that needs to be respected purely on the grounds of his influence. Because regardless of whether we agree or disagree with Marx or specific things in Marx, he thinks we need to respect him and attempt to understand him because of how inspirational of an author he is. And it's kind of interesting as well because Schumpeter in many ways is kind of doing what Marx did insofar as he's making economics interesting. Economics is generally boring as batshit. It's called the dismal science for a reason. But he remarks on how like Marx was able to turn it into almost a religion, his particular critique of economic theory. And while Schumpeter isn't like inaugurating a religion here in the same way that Marxism was established, he does, at least in my view, make this source material quite interesting in his method of presentation. Anyway, so he kind of divides Marx up into these four categories of what Marx does. Marx the prophet, Marx the sociologist, Marx the economist, and Marx the teacher. And Marx the prophet, he kind of remarks on how Marx's analysis, its kind of holism and its kind of historicity, its structure as an ideology gives to it a certain kind of almost religious quality where it can create these dogmatic adherence with some kind of materialist salvation in this kind of socialist future being the ultimate endpoint. And then he analyzes Marx on a sociological point of view and credits Marx with kind of innovating theory of class and like the role of class in history and in politics, and kind of credits him also with the ambition of politicizing, historicizing, and socializing economics and attempting to kind of connect all of these things together, which he believes is an ambition that Marx fails to live up to, particularly because of his failures. He's like over-reductive as a sociologist. He kind of reduces everything to this binary of proletariat, bourgeois, or whatever. And also he's massively problematic as an economist. But ultimately, the vision that he has, Schumpeter praises. And he sees this vision as being, because of its ambition and because, Marx has many good intuitions, is compelling in and of itself. Marx, may have been technically wrong in myriad ways, but often Marx's critics are even more wrong. And he says at least Marx is attempting to theorize capitalism as a system in toto and kind of embed his analysis in this kind of systemic analysis, which Schumpeter is about to kind of engage in himself in the rest of the book, where most economists just kind of satisfy themselves with very narrow analyses of very specific phenomena. Quote, he was the first economist of top rank to see and to teach systematically how economic theory may be turned into historical analysis. So then, in his exposition of Marx the teacher, I'm not going to go through all the kind of critiques of Marx the economist just now because I don't want to distract from the main point. But he points out that Marxists who aren't economists, will just kind of take his economic theory at face value. However, as far as the Marxist economist is generally concerned, quote, he worships at the shrine but turns his back upon it when he does his research. So he kind of comments on how, basically it's economics is kind of reductive. Marxists are constantly trying to kind of update it to new trends and then kind of confusedly stick it back into OG Marxism as a holistic project. But this is always awkward. And I guess Schumpeter is trying to kind of set up this appeal to his own project as a way, in a very roundabout and bizarre way of doing this, where he's kind of not trying to do Marxism, but he's trying to do something fundamentally the same as Marx, which is give this overarching analysis of what capitalism is and where it's going. So Schumpeter describes ultimately as well, which is a very key theme, that this process of monopolization and bureaucratization inherent to kind of capitalism's structure, basically that this will ultimately bring about socialism, and that this is how in which he envisages capitalism being the source of its own demise, as opposed to what you see in Marxism, where he notes this tension, where Marx, on one sense, is attempting to rebuke so-called utopian socialism and defend scientific socialism. And so there's this kind of trend in Marx's work where the forces of history and the forces within capitalism will tend inherently and deterministically to this particular conclusion. And so in a certain sense, what role is there for the revolutionary but to kind of just announce the end of capitalism, which has already been achieved for him by its own internal processes? Whilst at the same time, Marxism and Marxists are obviously a revolutionary movement, and Marx puts a lot of, shows a lot of sympathy towards this, and this is like a fundamental tension in Marx's work. And for Schumpeter, it kind of doesn't make any sense. He says if you really want to appreciate the fundamental analysis of Marx and what he's trying to do in his analysis of capitalism, it is completely incompatible with this kind of utopian revolutionary spirit. And so this kind of is one major drawback from his theory, is this confused contradiction. He gives him some credit for what he pulls off, but he quote, in his day, in Marx's day, peaceful transition was not so easy to see, and his pet idea of the two classes in battle made it still more difficult to see it. So Schumpeter says that what is brilliant about Marxism is that it's trying to demonstrate this deeper logic of evolution within capitalism, which revolution only comes along, quote, in order to write the conclusion under a complete set of premises. And so, he tries to kind of take out Marx the scientist from Marx the socialist. And he says, quote, socialist or revolutionary conclusions can be impressed on any scientific theory, but no scientific theory necessarily implies them. Say that Marx admits of interpretation in a conservative sense is only saying that he can be taken seriously. So to Schumpeter, Marx's theorist and Marx the ideologue need not necessarily be taken together. And this is kind of the lift-off to part 2, can capitalism survive? So Schumpeter's project then seems to be framed in this kind of ironic post-Marxism, where a conservative supporter of capitalism, namely Schumpeter, attempts to scientifically prophesy its collapse, into socialism. He first cautions that, quote, scientific analysis can only predict based upon, already present tendencies continuing, of which no certainty is, absolutely possible. So this inevitability of socialism that he's prophesying, he kind of puts the disclaimer, it's relativized to the persistence of the particular traits that he identifies and models as systemically dominant. Quote, "We shall see that the dominant traits of the picture clearly support certain inferences which, whatever the qualifications that may have to be added, are too strong to be neglected." So Schumpeter's notion that capitalism creates conditions which it cannot survive from a conservative perspective is, quote, "scientifically socialist despite being opposed in principle." Quote, "If a doctor predicts that his patient will die presently, this does not mean that he desires it." Much like, an anti-capitalist could view the breakdown of capitalism as maybe desirable, but quite unlikely. And you see this, on the left, he's kind of like the complete mirror image of this in a very funny way. So Schumpeter begins by defending capitalism against the charge of impoverishing the masses, which is obviously one of Marx's central critiques in the General Socialist critique. Quote, "The capitalist engine is first and last an engine of mass production, which unavoidably means also production for the masses." Now, obviously, he's writing in the 1940s. It would be very interesting to see what he would think about, so-called neoliberalism and this kind of deindustrialization and financialization process, post-1970s that we've been undergoing for like the last 50 years or so. But put this aside and, put yourself in the shoes of thinking in the 1940s, I guess. Quote, "The capitalist achievement does not typically consist in providing more silk stockings for queens, but in bringing them within the reach of factory girls." My view is that, of course, the real capitalist achievement was industrializing the Queen's military and enabling her empire to dominate international markets. This is a kind of fact that seems to be glossed over here in this argument, but nevertheless, I think you can see his point. He also gives credit for the emerging welfare state to capitalism as a possibility in the first place only due to the achievements of capitalist enterprise in mass productive efficiency. Schumpeter says that unemployment in itself isn't much of a problem for capitalism, in kind of contrast with Marx, because its very success enables the state to provide support to the unemployed. Unemployment for Schumpeter is a mere symptom of market adaptation to the so-called creative destruction of industry, which I will get to a bit later, which is this kind of central concept that is what capitalism fundamentally is, which he kind of believes drives the business cycle. And so the key then, Schumpeter isn't some libertarian. He says, quote, capitalism needs to provide adequately for the unemployed without impairing the conditions of further development. And so there's this balancing act between needing to have a welfare state and needing to keep innovating so you can keep paying for your welfare state. So for Schumpeter then, 20th century capitalism had industrialized to such a degree that it should be able to run a welfare state and maintain development in theory, with the failure to achieve this therefore being kind of a failure of policy or administration rather than endemic to capitalism itself. Schumpeter understood the need to maintain social and political stability in order to preserve the capitalist process of innovation through entrepreneurial enterprise. He doesn't subscribe to this arbitrary distinction of politics and economics that you get with other economists. He's looking at this systemically and cohesively and holistically. So he argues that if the performance of industrial production is demonstrably progressive in output capacity, and a mechanism favorable to this progression can be identified in the internal logic of the capital system itself, it seems reasonable to posit that this favorable logic, is the cause of industrial capacity's progress. So he goes in search for establishing this. He begins by identifying profit, or I guess you could say return on investment, as the conditioning and selection mechanism for the behavior of the bourgeois class. And this is key for Schumpeter, as ultimately in capitalism, status is performance-based. If you manage capital effectively, you get more and vice versa. When I read this, immediately I heard in the back of my mind Veblen's protests. Managing capital for the sake of getting more does not always correspond to industrial productive performance due to the kind of profitability of financialization and sabotage. But Schumpeter, to his credit, immediately recognizes this. And he does, again, this kind of brilliant agree and amplify thing where he points out that, yes, okay, money making is not necessarily reflective of actual productive contribution. Quote, between realizing that hunting for a maximum of profit and striving for maximum productive performance are not necessarily incompatible, to proving the former will necessarily imply the latter, there is a gulf much wider than the classical economists thought, and they never succeeded in bridging it. He saw the classical economists, like Marx, as having an excellent vision. They understood something was really great about capitalism that was driving innovative and productive potential, but they completely missed what it actually was, and the construction of the theory to kind of rationalize this vision was a total fuck-up, full of methodological errors, much like Marx. Quote, "It is important to remember that the ability to see things in their correct perspective may be, and often is, divorced from the ability to reason correctly and vice versa." So, related back to this idea, okay, money making doesn't necessarily correspond with productive capacity. He goes about building an analysis for why this doesn't completely undermine his kind of affirmation of capitalism. And it's centered around this notion that he critiques in the classical and to this day mainstream defense within economics of capitalism, that competition drives productive output. He says this is bunk. Quote, "The principle, as far as it can be proved at all, applies to a state of static equilibrium. Capitalist reality is first and last a process of change. In appraising the performance of competitive enterprise, the question whether it would or would not tend to maximize production in a perfectly equilibrated stationary condition of the economic process is hence almost, though not quite, irrelevant. So for Schumpeter, private competitive enterprise has virtues, but they have nothing to do with the inherent logic of competition. For Schumpeter, non-monopolistic competition is pretty much impossible outside of raw materials and agricultural mass production. In any event, the normal conditions of the market, he says, are monopolistic relations maintained by, quote, price strategy, quality strategy, product differentiation, and advertising. But for these monopolistic industries, Schumpeter demonstrates that sabotage, whilst preserving monopolies within the economic system and seeming on the face of it, impediments of industrial production, because there's costs to advertising campaigns, there's costs to suppressing new means of production, like buying up patents in order not to use them. Capitalism is built ultimately on this edifice of sabotage, and this precisely is what makes it so effective. Schumpeter stands alone as a kind of man, as I said earlier, who loves capitalism for what it truly is, rather than some ideological delusion which obfuscates its genuine nature. And so he kind of points out that ultimately competitive enterprise isn't actually capable of driving innovation, because in order to develop capital and invest that capital in research and innovative approaches to production, you generally need a surplus, and you generally need a form of protection. You generally need a form of defense against competition, so that you can actually attract capital and investment into the firm to kind of enable that firm to then become a kind of reliable source of returns for investors. Otherwise, the risk is too high, and the incentive for capital is to remain where it's already established. And so he kind of explicates this with his concept of creative destruction that I mentioned earlier. And he begins to explicate this by rebuking the, quote, entirely imaginary golden age of perfect competition that at some time somehow metamorphosed itself into the monopolistic age, whereas it is quite clear that perfect competition has at no time been more of a reality than it is at present. Quote, the modern standard of life of the masses evolved during the period of relatively unfettered, quote, big business. So he points out that technological productive development has almost entirely occurred in the most significant ways within so-called big business in states of monopolistic competition. And this is because for Schumpeter, competition doesn't drive capitalism, innovation does. Quote, the fundamental impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from the new consumer goods, new methods of production or transportation, new markets, and new forms of industrial organization that capitalist enterprise creates. So for Schumpeter, the economic structure of capitalism is constantly revolutionized from within by techno-industrial mutations to create new possibilities for production and simultaneously destroy the viability of superseded methods of doing business. For Schumpeter, capitalism's inefficiencies are vital to its self-problematization, which empowers its evolution by kind of granting it with evolutionary impulses. And this is why other economists can't see anything in monopolistic or oligopolistic industries but high prices and restrictions of output potential and sabotage, because they can't see the background context of creative destruction driving the system's most fundamental logic. Schumpeter rebukes conventional economists who model markets as these kind of stationary systems for accepting, quote, the data of momentary situations as if there were no past or future to it, and think they have understood what there is to understand if they interpret the behavior of firms by means of the principle of maximizing profits with reference to only that data. So instead, capitalists are always in a state of trying to keep their feet, quote, on a ground that is always slipping away from them. This ground moves technologically, and capital must move with it or face destruction. So the only competition which counts for Schumpeter then is, quote, the competition from the new commodity, the new technology, the new source of supply, the new type of organization. This competition possesses decisive advantages which doesn't merely attack the margins of profits. Classical economic theory, you have firms competing to basically make the same exact things, and they have these marginal efficiency gains on each other. They slightly figure out how to cost cut, make their product a little bit better, a little bit cheaper, or whatever. He says this kind of competition isn't that relevant. What's relevant is the kind of competition that attacks the very existence of entire firms and industries, which which can destroy an entire way of doing business. This means that firms can have monopolies and still feel the pressure of creative destruction because monopolies are subject to technological attack, not competitive attack, or innovative attack at least. Giving them an incentive, therefore, to pursue innovation despite temporary market dominance in order to ensure this dominance is maintained. Quote, long-range investing under rapidly changing conditions, especially under conditions that change or may change at any moment under the impact of new commodities and technologies, is like shooting at a target that's not only indistinct, but moving, and moving jerkily at that. And so he says this is why sabotage and monopolization is actually needed by the process of creative destruction in order to mitigate risk. And he cautions us, forget whether you want to take a moral position for or against this. He says you can take a moral position for or against this. Either way, it's still true. This is how it works. So these so-called, quote, excessive profits, they embolden risk-taking investment in industrial innovation, as does firm size, because they're greater able to absorb risk. They're big enough to actually have enough money to invest in a kind of research and development, department within a firm. Small business can't really do this. And this is why, as an aside, Mazzucato deployed Schumpeterian arguments in her work, The Entrepreneurial State, to explicate this kind of logic behind the contemporary empirical reality of state investment driving the most fundamental techno-industrial development, as the state, in many ways, is the biggest and baddest monopoly of them all, and can therefore bear the most risk, and have the biggest time preference, and has the most available capital. I think this is an argument deeply in the spirit of this text. So anyway, predatory firms which become dominant corporations, and then they develop the greatest agency to participate in creative destruction. Small firms in harsh competition, barely turning a profit, have no capacity to make any kind of real significant change to their established operating procedures and rhythms. The likelihood of them innovating is basically nil. Schumpeter then makes a radical claim that business sabotage protects rather than impedes innovation. Quote, there is no more of a paradox in this than there is in saying that cars can travel faster than they otherwise would because they are provided with brakes. He points to the behavior of industrial sectors which embody the impact of innovation on established industrial structure to illustrate this. Capital must be lured to take a risk and invest heavily to get new industries off the ground. Government assistance to protect and secure this capital, along with exceptional profits and reliable market share, is therefore a necessary means of getting capital out of more established places into these new productive practices, as I was saying earlier. Quote, there are superior methods of production available to the monopolist, which either are not available at all to the crowd of competitors or are not available to them so readily. And, quote, a monopoly position is in general no cushion to sleep on. Instead, it drives the setup, as I said before, of R&D departments. It drives capital to kind of search for innovation in order to maintain monopoly. Quote, free entry into a new field may make it impossible to enter at all. As a matter of fact, perfect competition is and always has been temporarily suspended whenever anything new is introduced. So, as I said, capital must be attracted, but also someone must always be first to innovate. And so they're always kind of granted a de facto monopoly in any kind of innovative market act, because if you're the first person to do something new, you have a monopoly over doing whatever that is. He says if this isn't protected, the incentive for capital to risk investing in entrepreneurship is greatly mitigated. And so this elaborate system of monopolization and sabotage kind of incentivizes and protects innovative risk-taking. Also, monopolistic conditions create price-setting agency for firms, meaning that they can generate excess profit and invest that surplus into the productive process rather than being forced to cost cut to survive competition. And also, monopolistic markets, he says, mean only the best CEOs survive. So to speak, only the, quote, best brains are left standing in industrial leadership positions as a result of this kind of tendency toward monopolization. So for Schumpeter, capitalism isn't a mere economic force, he says, but basically a rationalization of all human behavior. So he kind of affirms and amplifies monopoly. But then he kind of moves from this into a very interesting place where he kind of shows a deep understanding of capitalism, not simply as an economic process, but a force which kind of subordinates the entire social logic to mechanization, abstraction, and quantification. And this is what most fundamentally powers this force of creative destruction. And what's interesting is that Schumpeter himself indicates an awareness of the paradoxical irrationality at the core of individualism and liberalism, which is nevertheless rationalized by liberalism itself and the kind of bourgeois elite that promoted it as a logic that kind of reinforced and defended and justified their own behavior and desires. But what's interesting is that Schumpeter is seemingly a reactionary. I mean, he explicitly states that he views the counter-revolutionary and counter-enlightenment authors as basically being more sensible and having, far more to say on the subject of politics that he agrees with than the kind of liberal intelligentsia. And so what's interesting is that what is threatening capitalism for Schumpeter is seemingly the kind of unleashing of liberal rationalization, this kind of ideological rationalization via individualism. He describes as kind of liquidating the kind of sacralized religious and monarchical orders of the pre-liberal age that he said were ultimately necessary to kind of protect capitalism from itself. And now the bourgeois, in the position of needing to rule society without any kind of elite above them to appeal to or to derive legitimacy from, they substantiate themselves on the basis of ideology, and they're kind of leaving themselves open, therefore, to an attack by intellectuals that can then weaponize ideology against them, i.e. the socialist intellectuals. Ultimately, with this kind of liquidated aristocracy and priesthood, now the intellectual has been freed from like the limitations that he would have had under feudal rule, under a Catholic or at least Christian West, to attack the elite completely unmediated, basically on liberalism's own terms. He says at the same time as this is occurring, you see this kind of tendency toward absentee ownership where like capital allocation is becoming increasingly divorced from industrial coordination itself. And so at the very moment at which moral structure of society and political stability has been liquidated and they've been opened for attack by their own apparatus of rationalization and justification, simultaneously the capitalist is becoming alienated from production itself and it's becoming increasingly difficult to justify his role. So, yeah, he set up the kind of conditions of capitalism's own collapse quite interestingly here.
So Schumpeter established in his analysis of capitalism in the previous section that the rationalization, so to speak, of its liquidation of the pre-modern social order, this rationalization I would give the name liberalism, was also the fundamental source of its instability for Schumpeter. Quote, I have no hesitation in saying that all logic is derived from the pattern of the economic decision. The economic pattern is the matrix of logic. This is due to the inexorable definiteness and, in most cases, the quantitative characteristics that distinguish economic behavior from other spheres of human action. Once hammered in, the rational habit spreads its pedagogic influence to other things, and it also opens our eyes for that amazing thing, the fact. End quote. So, the process of secularization and the replacement of theology and tradition with social sciences and ideology as the primary means of political legitimacy, then for Schumpeter, is a direct result of market logic itself, colonizing the abstract structure of the social order. Capitalism then for Schumpeter is so much more than an economic system. It is the institutionalized belief in a world reducible to facts, which can be discovered through the deployment of epistemic technique. The market itself is just one of these techniques, maybe the technique, out of which the sciences are derived. So capitalism then for Schumpeter is more of a state of consciousness in which market logic instrumentalizes the entire civilizational edifice. And this is precisely where Schumpeter identifies capitalism's inevitable collapse into socialism, as this instrumental logic mechanizes the very process of capitalism itself, insofar as the entrepreneurial function is mechanized. Quote, technological progress is increasingly becoming the business of teams of trained specialists who turn out what is required and make it work in predictable ways, as opposed to the kind of heroic entrepreneur of early capitalism that he described last week. So economic progress itself for Schumpeter then is becoming depersonalized and automated. Bureaus and committees are replacing the acts of individual genius. This is incredibly perceptive to see this back in 1942 when this book came out. I think this is incredibly accurate. We've only seen this tendency increase, I think, in the 80 years or so since he wrote this book. Quote, the perfectly bureaucratized giant industrial unit not only ousts the small or medium-sized firm and expropriates its owners, but in the end it also ousts the entrepreneur and expropriates the bourgeoisie as a class which in the process stands to lose not only its income, but also what is infinitely more important, its function. So not only is the role of the capitalist in the economy becoming technologically and institutionally redundant, but Schumpeter views the capitalist class itself vulnerable to the very rationalizations of liberal intellectuals that liquidated the authority of aristocratic rule. Quote, in breaking down the pre-capitalist framework of society, capitalism thus broke not only barriers that impeded its progress, but also flying buttresses that prevented its collapse. So for Schumpeter, the church and monarchies and aristocracies of Europe had a kind of symbiosis with the capitalist class under early capitalism that ensured social stability. But not only this, the dignity of individual participants in the economic system itself also wanes in the very same process of mechanization that liquidates the entrepreneur. Without a strong church and state to correct this and restrict the total dissolution of all society into market logic, this soulless corporate bureaucracy replaces the personality of business and removes all loyalty and all embeddedness socially in that reinforces the conservation of the social order and capitalist structure itself. Quote, dematerialized and defunctionalized, absentee ownership does not impress and call forth moral allegiance, as the vital form of property did. Eventually there will be nobody left who really cares to stand for it. So for Schumpeter then, not only does capitalism destabilize itself in practice, but it also creates a critical frame of mind which destroys the moral authority of the very institutions which restrain it from itself, becoming morally reprehensible to its population. Quote, the bourgeoisie finds to his amazement that the rationalist attitude does not stop at the credentials of kings and popes, but goes on to attack private property and the whole scheme of bourgeois values. Capitalism then for Schumpeter invites the resentful intellectual to rationalize their hostility toward it in order to seize its immense power and wealth. Quote, no doubt it is possible, for a time, to buy them off, but this last resource fails as soon as they discover they can have it all. Schumpeter views the Enlightenment delusion of a social order built upon reason and reason alone with contempt. A sacred tradition is required to deal with sub- or super-rational impulses. If a civilization liquidates it, they lose the capacity to discipline them and make revolt inevitable, as now any resentment can be rationalized into a justification for the intellectual class to usurp power by riling up the population ideologically. Quote, in defending the intellectuals as a group, the bourgeoisie defends itself and its scheme of life, i.e. liberalism. But only a government of non-bourgeois nature and non-bourgeois creed, under modern circumstances a socialist or fascist one, is strong enough to discipline them. This tendency within the logic of the capitalist process to tolerate intellectuals is only exacerbated by the industrialization of the educational and scientific institutional systems themselves, which are facilitated by capitalist development. The industrialization of education converts much of it into a practically frivolous exercise producing a class of resentful, educated people who feel too high status to be an unskilled worker, and yet they have basically no productive skills. But also this new intellectual class is primed then to kind of staff an expanding bureaucracy which needs to rationalize its role and expansion, leading to a kind of self-perpetuating technocratic drive that rivals the bourgeoisie for control of the state. Schumpeter also blames the dominance of capitalist logic for liquidating family values, and with them the time horizon of the population, leading to a decline in conservatism, work ethic, saving, long-term investment, and social stability. He didn't see this coming, but of course we see this bureaucratization of the post-familial or post-traditional social order as kind of a key component to all of this. The bureaucracy has now inserted itself in contemporary society as a kind of ideological vanguard that secures this post-familial identity in the feminist or LGBT movements and their uptake, not just by the state, but by the professional bureaucracy that has inserted itself into the corporate structure of HR departments and so forth. But anyway, so Schumpeter defines then capitalism as private property and means of production and regulation of the productive process by private contract in order to kind of set this up as destined for self-destruction and dissipation or dissolution into socialism, which he defines as central authority controlling the means of production and production itself. It is the inevitability of this internal failure of capitalism which will produce socialism as the economic system of the future for Schumpeter. The question is how, right? This is the main question of part 3. So mainstream economics maintains that socialism is performatively impossible. It will always lose out to capitalism in the end because of its inefficiencies. And so Schumpeter must begin by dealing with this, and he kind of takes on Mises' famous calculation problem, which he says is inherent to centrally planned economies, in order to offer a practical model for how socialism could actually work in practice. He needs to build a rational socialism. So Schumpeter describes in very simple terms how a price system could still function if every industry was run by some kind of central authority, by simply selling its products to consumers for state-issued vouchers or credits, which could be equitably distributed, and each industrial board would simply need to use these credits to, quote, purchase the means of production from some kind of central board that would administer them, meaning that the central board could determine where productive resources were most needed based upon consumer demand, enabling industrial boards to purchase more or less amounts of the means of production, to give it a kind of basic calculation or a basic rationality grounded in consumer decisions. Schumpeter then brings his subtle irony back in and describes how investment, saving, wage premiums, and various other constitutive features of the capitalist economy could be introduced into this system to further optimize the efficiency or capability of this, quote, socialist system to technologically innovate, making it sound less and less like socialism as he goes. But he cautions us that this is simply how, quote, rational calculation works. And it's true whether you're capitalist or socialist, the market lives on, even if it's administered now by a central authority rather than private contract. Quote, only the most naive mind could feel disappointed at the fact that the socialist miracle does not create a logic of its own, and only the crudest and most stupid variants of the socialist creed can be endangered by any demonstration to that effect. Those variants, according to which the capitalist process is nothing but a wild jungle without any logic or order at all. So Schumpeter also brings up again the point from earlier in the text that not only is monopoly capitalism the only real capitalism, it is also far more effective at technological innovation and productive optimization. Schumpeter points out that state intervention in the capitalist economy and the hostile strategic landscape of corporate sabotage and the basically investment gambling inherent to it would be present in the socialist central planning model, where the incentive to reproduce that hostility and strategic complexity wouldn't exist. The complex battle between firms, industries, and the private or public interest aren't productively efficient. And so a socialist arrangement, Schumpeter thinks, is a superior rationality, as many of the so-called best minds currently being wasted as lawyers engaging in these legal battles between corporations and states, or corporations and one another, could find new and more productive jobs free from competitive struggles between market actors and the state. And so this inefficiency and wastefulness of the conflict inherent to capitalist institutionality, a solution is offered by the calm rationality of the socialist project. But the key problem with socialism that Schumpeter identifies is that absent this conflict, the most creative and capable individuals have less means of leverage and are easy to exploit, killing their incentive to produce exceptionally. He offers the solution, however, of recruiting them into positions within the bureaucracy, and you kind of see this actually in the Chinese Communist Party of today and its internal model. Schumpeter stresses the need for meritocratic process to achieve this, along with asymmetrical social prestige and status being facilitated. He then ironically flirts with the notion of just paying them more. So it's funny how Schumpeter, he sets up this whole model of socialism, but ultimately he just kind of smuggles in all these capitalist concepts in through the back door, saying, oh yes, socialism would work, but it would be based upon the rationality inherent to capitalism. So yeah, there is this kind of subtle irony here, although he is being unironic at the same time, it seems. Schumpeter also praises socialism, again in this ironic fashion, for its capacity to bring the labor and intellectual movements which undermine capitalism under control, and generally set up authoritarian governments that discipline these movements, meaning socialism can enforce far harsher and less negotiable workplace discipline and really crack the whip on the working class they quote-unquote liberated. Quote, socialism may be the only means of restoring social discipline. So Schumpeter actually affirms the Marxian notion that the economic process under capitalism tends to socialize itself, and in this way Schumpeter doubts revolutionary means will achieve the transition as opposed to a kind of progressive formalization. Revolutions for Schumpeter are signs of immature capitalism or immature socialism, a transition occurring for reasons of political opportunism before capitalism has properly undermined itself internally, as he described, is therefore problematic and often obstructive to the final goals. So in many ways, Schumpeter views the socialist revolution as an impediment to socialization itself, a task best undertaken by capitalism itself, and so he advises the socialists to simply support increasing monopolization, bureaucratization, and nationalization within capitalism and allow the process to mature conservatively. So yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting take on socialism and how it would be possible. He's basically offering a defense of state capitalism or fascism or, something very similar to what you would see in China today, rather than the kind of utopian model of socialism given by so-called revolutionaries. And what's really fundamental here is, I think, the role of the intellectual. The intellectual class becomes the key underlier to the capitalist social order. It must rationalize everything, but that very rationalized social order undermines the position of the capitalist within the social order, and at the same time, the capitalist becomes, as I said before, depersonalized, mechanized, taken out the process, and becomes far less relevant. We get these larger, more hegemonic institutions that govern technological development, that bureaucratize production, that bureaucratize management in various ways, and the intellectual is the natural leader of this massive bureaucratic apparatus. And so he's describing this process by which the intellectual achieves dominance, a kind of final technocratic dominance over the aberration of capitalism, which was just a kind of bridge between the pre-modern world of the church, the monarchy, and the aristocracy ruling, and the technocracy of the future. I find this quite perceptive, but with that, I'm going to throw it to Owen.
This week we deal with part 4, the section on democracy. Essentially what it seems like is Schumpeter gives a critique of democracy that is analogous to his critique of neoclassical economics, where he takes a lot of the critiques, like reactionary critiques of democracy, but then does the same thing that he does with socialist critiques of capitalism. He affirms and amplifies them, ends up affirming democracy much like he affirms capitalism, in a way very different than what the propaganda articulates these things as, but instead affirms them more in their reality. But first, before I get into that, toward the end of part 3, I'm just going to note this to contextualize. Schumpeter predicts that capitalism's success would greatly reduce demand for wealth, and that instead prestige would become the central motive that drives the desire to ascend institutional hierarchies. And this again appears to be a rather perceptive insight in my view, as the emerging technocracy which usurps control of capitalism from within doesn't do it for the money so much as for the improved social position that is engendered by participation. This corresponds to Schumpeter's overall diagnosis of capitalism and its process of industrialization and mechanization being ultimately a socializing force that, whilst at first emerging out of the affirmation of the individual, ultimately becomes an imposition of a collectivizing and bureaucratizing institutionality. The corporation replaces the individual capitalist as the locus of agency. And so it becomes progressively less about what I get and increasingly more about who I am. Status rather than income comes to dominate economic concern. And this is, in the abstract sense, a kind of almost return to feudalism in a way, as established institutional social position again becomes the primary determination of economic distribution rather than individual relationships, i.e. contracts, as under capitalism and early liberalism. So Schumpeter begins by acknowledging that socialists only support democracy when it is politically expedient, but also acknowledges that this is true for everyone. And his kind of overall view is that socialism and democracy are both compatible and incompatible, and that one doesn't necessarily require the other or negate the other. So you'll have, the right-winger conservative who says socialism is incompatible with democracy, the left-wing who says socialism is the only way to achieve democracy, and Schumpeter rejects both these views. And he points this out by saying that if you truly believe something to be evil or immoral, merely pointing to popular sentiment is an insufficient response to the desire to do away with it. Democracy then for Schumpeter can only be understood as a means, but not an end in itself. So it could be a means to socialism or a means to capitalism. And this is why the definition of the people and their supposed rule diverges massively throughout history according to changing circumstances, as we need to rationalize different ends for the democratic process. For Schumpeter, the notion of the rule of the people is merely a kind of ritual of consenting to rule in practice in representative democracy. Schumpeter also points out that most autocracies have the support of the majority of their citizens even if they don't perform this consent ritual. Quote, the people never actually rule, but they can be made to do so by definition. So Schumpeter then gets into this critique of liberal ideology and describes how these problematic, highly ambiguous concepts like the common good and the will of the people are crafted to ideologically narrate this consent ritual. And this, of course, relies on the notion that rationality is in principle able to make what is good intelligible to an individual participant in the democratic process. Eventually, a common notion is supposed to emerge from this rational process of public democratic discourse. Of course, the problem with this for Schumpeter is that value isn't rational. Valuations are these pre-rational things that are merely rationalized but not constructed by liberal discourse and the democratic process. Quote, as soon as we have severed the will of the people from its utilitarian connotation, we are building not merely a different theory of the same thing, but a theory of a completely different thing. So for Schumpeter, once the utilitarian calculation theory of democratic participation is undermined by recognizing the irrationality of political belief and knowledge formation, democracy becomes a rather vapid concept, or at least needs to be totally redefined. Quote, if we are to argue that the will of the citizens per se is a political factor entitled to respect, it must first exist. That is to say, it must be something more than an immediate bundle of vague impulses loosely playing about given slogans and mistaken impressions. For democracy then to be a tenable notion, some method of epistemological competence and autonomy must be demonstrated by the general population for Schumpeter. Also, Schumpeter doubts whether even if this rational discourse could be individuated demonstrably in the average citizen's political worldview as this kind of self-constructed process, whether opposing factions can really compromise within the process anyway. History demonstrates that generally democracy is a tussle between factions attempting to subjugate one another. Many historical examples also of autocratic states which succeed at maintaining a peaceful compromise between factions that turn on each other under democratic conditions. A compromise usually must be imposed from above in practice, and he gives the example of Napoleon restoring order to post-revolutionary France as the archetypal example of this. Schumpeter then moves to bring up the obvious examples of the irrationality of crowds and draw the obvious analogy between the irrational consumer that's persuaded to violate the neoclassical model of his behavior by marketing techniques and the irrational voter persuaded to abandon his so-called rational self-interest by ideological propagandists. Ultimately, politics is just too complicated for the average citizen to critically decide upon in any kind of complete sense. So consuming propaganda uncritically is basically the only viable alternative to total apathy and non-participation. Quote, without the initiative that comes from immediate responsibility, ignorance will persist in the face of masses of information, however complete and correct. And so this means that for Schumpeter, the will of the people is manufactured. The public are mere consumers of political knowledge at best. Most of the public, however, are barely even this. They're more consumers of mere political sentiment. Schumpeter then assigns a cool and rather apt term, I think, to the manufacture of political will: psychotechnics. He then asks why an idea as retarded as the will of the people remains so hegemonic in our society. Everyone knows democracy doesn't really work as it claims, and yet most affirm it anyway. Why is this? Schumpeter points out that democracy has taken on a religious dogma-like quality. It is a sacred and romantic ideal which the ritual practice doesn't need to perfectly honor in a kind of rational sense in order for it to be true in the minds of the masses. So we have this kind of romanticized notion of democracy then, which basically means whatever my team winning means in reality. If the opponent wins, usually it's understood as that they've cheated or duped the public in some way, but when our side wins, it is on behalf of the people and all the romanticism that that entails. Schumpeter then proposes an alternative and more realistic definition of democracy. Quote, an institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. He says this solves the problem with the so-called classical theory of democracy, which for Schumpeter, quote, attributed to the electorate an altogether unrealistic degree of initiative, which practically amounted to ignoring leadership. Schumpeter asserts that collectives act exclusively through accepting leadership. This is the institutional reality of civilized society. Democracy then institutionalizes the competitive psychotechnics of manufacturing will. Converting the raw impulses of the public into political institutionality is basically how democracy generates political change. Schumpeter also describes how the practicalities of so-called democratic rule are highly conditioned in practice. Quote, the wishes of parliamentary members are not, as a rule, the ultimate data of the process by which government emerges. Members are not only handcuffed by party obligations, they are also driven by the man whom they elect, driven to the act of election itself exactly as they are driven by him once they have elected him. So the way bureaucracy is then run by the cabinet, which claims to execute the will of the people, Schumpeter points out usually presents these very people with results they never thought of and would not have approved in advance. And so the strategic logic behind political decision-making is entirely centered around maintaining and reinforcing, or for the formal opposition, undermining the leadership of a prime minister or a president's administration and a party's legislative or policy agenda. Democracy in practice, then, for Schumpeter, is a competitive game where rival prospective leaders jostle to influence and assert an agenda which is itself manufactured by the institutionalized political machine, not popular will. Quote, the psychotechnics of party management and party advertising, slogans, and marching tunes are not accessories. They are the essence of politics. So is the political boss. So this means that democracy is ultimately ruled by a competitive struggle between politicians and therefore degenerates into a kind of mere battle for power through generally Machiavellian scheming and PR that must coalesce around specific political leaders who hold dominant positions through strategic competence for specific periods of time. Quote, the democratic method creates professional politicians, whom it then turns into usually amateur administrators and statesmen. A politician who is a good tactician can successfully survive any number of administrative miscarriages, and so for Schumpeter, there is obviously a large problem with the democratic process in terms of creating competent statesmen, but he qualifies all of this by pointing out that basically all government, autocracy or democracy, has these traits to a large extent, and so the competitive struggle in representative democracy, at the very least, does not necessitate a total lack of competency and leading and organizing. In fact, it can be a vehicle through which competency can be realized. The quality of the political class itself, then, is the real question, rather than whether it's democratic or autocratic. The advantage that democracy gives it is that it can take steps to formally limit their competition and struggle in ways that ensure their ability to stably and competently govern is encouraged in toto. And this means in practice that many norms, standards, and traditions must be established and maintained in order to kind of maintain the smooth functioning of a representative democracy. And this is analogous to a feudal aristocracy. If you just have some tyrannical absolute monarch making arbitrary decisions, completely unembedded from traditional norms that held the gentry, the aristocracy, and the church and so forth together, you can get tyrannical government. And he says it's the same thing with representative democracy in its own way. So you need to have civilized processual norms that protect the political contest from deteriorating into anarchy or tyranny or other detestable outcomes. And so ultimately for Schumpeter, it isn't democracy itself that is inherently bad or good, but it is just a process which ultimately is determined by the quality of its participants.